Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. And also welcome to my How Did They Stack Up series. We're down to two constructors. We're down to Mercedes and Red Bull. Today we'll be talking about Mercedes and how well did they stack up to the teams around them, and how did the drivers stack up to the drivers that were ended up around them at the end of the season. And without further ado, we will start off with this nice little chart here that shows Mercedes ended up the Constructors' Champion in second position. Not quite making it to that first position, as we all know, wasn't quite in their grasp, but a little ahead of where I predicted them in the preseason, where I had them in third. Now, the preseason, they didn't look so good. They were kind of struggling, and especially in that preseason testing, it didn't look like they were going to have the means to really be able to compete, as they were kind of dragging their car concept a little farther than they should have, and they weren't able to develop it like they needed to be really competitive. Now, my in-season rating was a 2, so they ended up coinciding with the actual Constructors' Champion of second position, and they ended up in a score of 7.4 for that. Now, how I ended up with that score was that I rated each driver and every race that they participated in from 1 to 10, and then I took the average of those scores, and that came to that score of 7.4, which put them in that second position. Now, that was equally what they ended up in the official Constructors' Champion, even though it's kind of rated a little bit different because it's rated more on the points for the Constructors' Championship that the drivers make versus how well I thought each driver performed in each race. And with the car behind them, if they really pushed that car, were they able to get all of that out of that car, or were they leaving stuff on the table during that setting? Those are how I came up with those scores. So we look at the drivers themselves. So we have George Russell, whose official drivers' championship ended up in 8th position. I had him in 7th in my preseason, so he was a little bit behind than my preseason rating was. But my in-season rating was a little higher than he ended up in 5th with a score of 7.23. So he did better getting more out of that car than I was thinking he was going to be able to do that. And of course, with the preseason, I was thinking they were going to lag a little bit farther behind, not quite be up there. I figured he was going to lag Lewis, which he did, but a little bit more than he ended up doing. So it was good to see Russell up there at the beginning of the season, really get the most out of that, even though he made some mistakes, we can see throughout this charts that we coming up that kind of hurt him, whereas Lewis Hamilton was a lot more steady throughout the season. And of course, we talk about Lewis Hamilton, who ended up the drivers' champion in 3rd. So I know he wanted to be up there in that second position, but didn't quite make it into that second position. So he ended up in 3rd. My predictions were 5th, so a little bit farther back in the field. As I said, I didn't think they were going to be that well, so I figured they were going to be dropping a little bit farther back in the pack than they ended up. Now, my in-season rating was a little bit higher, so he actually got that second position on my in-season rating with a score of 7.57. So Lewis Hamilton, I think, really shown why he was a past champion, being able to consistently get points, consistently be in the mix, even though he may not be at the very front of those at points and times, but he was more consistent throughout the season than his teammate George Russell. And we kind of can see this here in this graph between the two, how well they compared to each other. Now, here we have every race at the bottom of this graph with the position they ended up in the x-axis. So the farther down on this graph you are, the better, because you want to be in that first position, not the 20th position. So this is kind of an inverse graph in the sense of what you may be used to seeing. Now, you also have a couple of trend lines. So if you're going, that trend line's going up like Lewis was at the end of the season, that's bad. If you're dropping down, that's good, because it means you're getting better places at the end of the season than you were at the beginning. Now, here we basically see cutter, which Lewis had an issue with, and the United States where he was disqualified. So that kind of knocked that out, which I think kind of skewed his trend line more than it should have. Whereas George Russell was pretty steady, on that mark, maybe going down slightly as the season went through, which was good. But you could see those big jumps in those areas where he had issues with the car. The car had where he had to, didn't quite make the end of the race, or he had to drop back way in the field because of circumstances. He had a lot more of those than Lewis Hamilton. Of course, that 10 right there is the marker for the official point standing. So anything at that point and below was the official points. And so you can see Lewis Hamilton basically scored all but 2 races. And George had several races that he didn't actually get points in. And that's kind of made the difference here. As I said, you can kind of see the consistency more of on Lewis Hamilton, always gaining points, even though by the end of the season they were kind of dropping off a little bit more than at the beginning. Even they were still struggling, but they weren't able to really develop that car to keep up with that standing. So I think Lewis did a really good job, even though you could heard him all season complaining about that car not being where it wanted to, not being in that position where he could really gain ground. And I know they're changing that concept for that car for this 2024 season, so we'll have to see how well they were able to gain the knowledge from these other seasons to really affect that, even though they're making big changes. Hopefully they understand what they're doing and are coming out competitive and not have to weird results that they're going to have to go back and refigure out why those results were there, because they didn't match up to their data that they were getting before, because they're completely shifting their driver car concept. So it's going to be a lot of changes, so that might affect them at least at the beginning of 2024. But anyway, we're talking about 2023, and here you can see those 2 trend lines. And so as I said, that bad issue that he had in Qatar and then the disqualification didn't help his trend line in that result. But overall, you can see that it was increasing or decreasing his place position. So he was getting worse as the season went on, whereas George Russell was more consistent, even though he had in the overall of getting better or worse, even though he had a lot of mistakes or a lot of issues with the car throughout the season. And Lewis Hamilton had a much more consistent point running runs than George did. And that's kind of what that trend line shows. So we'll jump over to George Russell and how he compared to the drivers around him. So George was officially in 8th, as I said, and had 175 points. Oscar Piastri was in 9th behind him with 97, and Carlos Sainz was ahead of him in 7th with 200. And you can see George in blue, Carlos in yellow, and Oscar in red here. And you can kind of see this nice wild graph here that shows lots of issues with all 3 of those drivers as they were going throughout this season. The same setup is here with the races at the bottom and the position they ended up in each race on the x-axis. So again, the bottom is the better, and the trend lines are kind of what you're looking here for and the results. So you basically see Oscar Piastri getting much better throughout the season, mainly because they finally figured out how to deal with that McLaren and get the right setup on those, as they realized that they had gone the wrong direction at the beginning of the season and corrected that early on. So they were able to adjust. Even though he was a rookie, he still had several issues, but was able to actually perform. So his was getting better throughout the season, doing a really good job, but not quite where he needed to be to really be competitive against George Russell on the point standings, mainly because of the beginning of the season. Now we have Carlos Sainz on the other side, who started off fairly decently, compared to George Russell. And then by the end was having a little more offs at the end, causing him to drop back into the clutches of George Russell, but not quite to that point where George can take advantage of that. So Carlos was getting worse. Looks like, George Russell was pretty constant on his trend line, even though he was having several big offs that if he could be able to correct, he would be a really good driver, and be super competitive for that front positioning. And you have Oscar Piastri getting better throughout the season as he gets that McLaren under his belt and knows how to run that McLaren. And that McLaren was improving quite a bit at that mid-season mark to the end. So that's kind of why those show up that direction. But I figured it's kind of an interesting view of how those drivers compared to each other from that point standing side of things. So now we will look at Lewis Hamilton. And Lewis Hamilton, of course, is in blue here in third position with 234 points. Behind him is Fernando Alonso in fourth with 206. And Sergio Perez, who was just ahead of him in that 285-point range. So here, all three trend lines are getting worse throughout the season, which is interesting to see. Fernando had an awesome beginning of the year, and they couldn't maintain that in that Aston Martin. So he started getting worse throughout this year. And I know they took some wrong directions in the development of Aston Martin, which did not help him in the least. But he's a crafty driver and is able to get decent results from that Aston Martin throughout the season, even though it was dropping back in the clutches of this season as the season went on. And then, of course, you have Sergio Perez, who had some issues with qualifying and had to make up positions near the end of the season. Kind of got flustered where he wasn't able to really be truly competitive against his teammate Max Verstappen, and that kind of threw him, which made it worse in those certain situations, getting in his head, making it really hard as the press is always hounding you on those situations. So he had to get really clear his head, and you can kind of see that he started doing that in Vegas and Abu Dhabi and a little bit in Brazil, coming back to a more founding rating in those races. But in the meantime, he had some offs and some issues that he had to get through. So you can see those big spikes there, marking them off, whereas that really helped Lewis Hamilton gain ground on him during those situations, except for that Qatar kind of offset some of that as well. Whereas Fernando just kind of seemed to start off with a nice narrow band and start getting worse and worse, trying to really push that Aston Martin and causing some, risk that he may not have necessarily needed to take, that had some issues at the end of the season as it went on. But it was kind of interesting that all three of them were going to get worse throughout the season. They weren't really compared, with the rest of the drivers around them getting better in that sense as the season went on, because they were having to fight each other more in that season as all those cars are getting developed, all to the most part, trying to get that extra edge on each other. And how that came about and how that looks. So, how did the team do? So here we have the same races at the bottom, and then the x-axis is how many points each team actually scored for each race. So here, the higher the better, because that's the more points you look at and gain throughout this. And so this is a more normal graph in the sense of trend lines. So you basically see Red Bull actually getting worse throughout the season. But, they had such an advantage that they could actually start focusing on the development of next year's car earlier and not have to worry about trying to be competitive. Whereas Mercedes and Ferrari were having to actually develop their cars more in this sense. So you have Mercedes with 409 points, Ferrari behind them with 406, And Red Bull with that whopping 860 points ahead of Mercedes in that first running position. Then you can kind of easily see that in this nice graph. So basically you see here Ferrari gaining ground as the season went on, whereas Mercedes and Red Bull were losing ground in this sense. So Ferrari's the positive note there, but you see Red Bull basically having a parallel trend line to Red Bull. So we'll see if that can change over or get closer together over the break, to see if those developments that Mercedes is bringing are going to be that much more competitive. It's a big team. It's a well-experienced team, so there is hope there. But with Red Bull having to be able to develop a lot of that this year towards next year, not having to really keep that Red Bull at the top tier mark by spending a lot of their time doing this year's car, it's hard to say that Red Bull is not going to be in that first position next year as well. But we'll have to see how the preseason testing and the first few races go for the 2024. Anyway, I thought this is a nice graph for the trend lines for each team. And we can see the little step graph here of how points ended up in those gaps between the three teams on the top ranked throughout the season. So, of course, at the first, you had Red Bull doing really well, had that nice lead, and they basically kept it the whole way through, gaining ground on Mercedes and Ferrari, where Mercedes were pretty constant. Ferrari was struggling a little bit in that mid-season and then started gaining ground, or Mercedes started dropping off so Ferrari could gain that ground back to be potentially into that second position, where instead Mercedes was able to maintain that second position for a few points there at the end. So that's a nice little gap saying, hey, Red Bull was running away with it, and the fight there for that second position was really fairly close between Ferrari and Mercedes throughout the season, even though you had a fewer gaps in the middle that kind of got a little bit bigger as that progressed. So what is coming up next? Well, we have the last team, and you have Red Bull and how well they stacked up. So it's kind of a teaser there, but you have the two drivers and where they ended up. So that kind of gives you incentives to watch that video. And if you would like to see any other kind of things, please leave those in the comments, because I have a few weeks to develop some of those videos if you come up with something interesting. And of course, I'll do the Red Bull, how they stacked up, probably on Wednesday is when that will be released. And until then, I will see you on the grid. And if you made it this far, please like and subscribe, and farewell.